Thank you so much for being here. We're so excited about this program. Today we have Commissioner Andrew French moderating our discussion, and we have amazing panelists, Antoine Lucas from Southwest Power Pool and Aubrey Johnson from, I'm going to say it, MISO instead of MISO this time. We all learn our lessons as we go. Thank you guys so much for being here. We're so excited about this. This is the first time we've tried to do a two-part webinar. So today is part one of Prudent and Efficient, a discussion of optimal transmission planning and development for 2022 and beyond. Please join us again on March 9th at noon Central, where we'll have panel 2. Don't want to take up too much of your time with housekeeping. You can turn on your cameras and your microphone for question and answer. I ask that you not just randomly turn on your video and your microphone during our distinguished panel. Thank you so much for your time and enjoy. Commissioner French, you're still on mute. There we go.
I was waiting for Dr. Sakuda. Or are you jumping straight to me?
I was going to jump straight to you.
All right, very good. Well, then let me welcome in our panelists. As Sarah mentioned, we have Aubrey Johnson from MISO, and we have Antoine Lucas from the Southwest Power Pool. And she's given a good introduction, but let me just say that, you know, if I was someone interested in understanding, you know, how we plan our grid and how an energy transition might take place and the nuts and bolts of you know, what the preconditions are going to have to be for that to happen, I honestly could not think of two better people. These are the folks that can actually tell you how that process needs to play out. So I'm really excited to be joined by Aubrey and Antoine today. So let's jump right in, and maybe just a brief introductory opportunity for both Mr. Johnson and Mr. Lucas to make some opening comments on the topics that were outlined. And I guess I'd ask that your comments address SPP and MISO's organizational views of the infrastructure legislation that was passed last year, and any immediate opportunities that you think will help shape your efforts at comprehensive planning. And, you know, maybe just give us a couple minutes of opening thoughts, and I will begin with Aubrey Johnson from MISO.
Well, good morning, Commissioner French, and thank you for those kind words. I'll remember to share that with my manager, your thoughts as we're coming up on review time. So I appreciate those insights. I'd also appreciate the opportunity to be here to discuss MISO's approach to planning and our view of the infrastructure legislation passed last year. We see many challenges as the grid changes to meet customer preferences, policy goals, and the goals of our member utilities. We call this shared responsibility to maintain reliable operations of the grid during this transition the reliability imperative. In MISO, we're meeting this challenge with 4 major initiatives, one of which is focused on long-range transmission planning, or LRTP. This initiative is focused on regional backbone projects, the first tranche of projects which we're currently working on and we're expecting to present to our board for approval in June. These are meant to be no regrets projects that show up in all of our futures, or would meet the needs of all of the futures that we currently plan for, as well as be in place in time to enable our member utilities' stated renewable energy goals to be achieved. We recently submitted a cost allocation methodology with support from the majority of our transmission owners to enable these projects. In addition to regional projects, we also realized the portfolio change transcends RTO boundaries, and we're getting ready to release the final report of the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue study. That'll happen this week. This is a joint venture with SPP. And we'll talk more about this project a little bit. I'm sure Antoine and I will have plenty of comments on that. So we're proud of the resulting projects that are recommended from that, and they have important reliability capability efforts as well too. And it's a great coordination between MISO and SPP teams during the past year, as well as the stakeholder process. So as we're undergoing these processes, like you, will continue to dig into this infrastructure bill that was passed last year. We look forward to working with our member utilities to identify potential opportunities to take advantage of that where possible.
Thanks, Audrey. Great comments. We will now move to Mr. Antoine Lucas from the Southwest Power Pool.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. And it's always difficult to follow Aubrey. I was hoping that you called on me first because we have so many of the same or very similar challenges that we're working on. You know, SPP is really approaching the challenges that we face right now with this changing resource mix. I say in a very similar fashion to what MISO has, what Aubrey mentioned as far as MISO's approach. You know, one of the primary things that we're really focused on is resource adequacy, recognizing that as we move from what some folks call dispatchable, controllable resources to more variable energy resources whose output is more dependent upon the availability of their fuel. For wind, that being wind, for solar, the irradiance of the sun. And that is something that creates a bit of, you know, some level of uncertainty around consistent ability to be able to reliably serve load. Now, resource adequacy, of course, starts on the generating resource side of the equation. However, we recognize transmission as a amazing enabler to have flexibility in the availability and deliverability of those resources to serve load consistently and reliably as well. Now, over the years, SPP has taken on a number of planning initiatives that have been focused on helping our members as well as our respective states within our regions meet any renewable policy standards that they may have in our planning processes. And we've done that for a number of years. I think right now SPP has helped our states at least meet the RPSs as they stand today, but we stand prepared to continue to help our states meet those requirements as they may change over time. Also, as Aubrey mentioned, you know, we recognize in a footprint like ours, which is very rich in renewables, both wind and solar, the availability of that natural resource can exceed the demand or the need for customers within our region. And as a result, we do need improved mechanisms to be able to transfer that excess resource to our neighbors throughout the country who also have a need for clean renewable energy. And so we continue to work together and partner with MISO in a discussion I look forward to having where we're working together consistently and continuously developing planning processes and mechanisms to help us develop the policies necessary to transfer power across our respective seams to be able to support others in the country in meeting the goal. Lastly, as far as the Building a Better Grid initiative goes, we too are continuing a pretty deep and thorough analysis of the implications of that. I will say, from an SPP standpoint, we think it's a good initiative. It's a noble initiative, and it's just something that we're working to determine how best we can support it. Also, as tends to be somewhat of a challenge with these types of initiatives, is just determining the appropriate way to coordinate. That's really the focus in figuring out the how. I think the what is a very good one. The how is where the challenges lie. And I think that's what we'll talk about some today and continue to talk about beyond today to figure out how to effectuate this new rule.
Thanks, Antoine. Yeah, there's a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different jurisdictional boundaries that we all have to cross and deal with. as we look at these opportunities. Well, you've kind of started to tee up, or maybe even started to address my next question. But it is the big question of the day, and it's the big question that's really posed by some of the federal government's initiatives and goals for us. And so I guess the question is, how do your organizations consider the energy transition and the increasing penetration of variable resources in developing your regional plans? And Antoine, you mentioned this, but how do you factor in states' public policy goals, such as lower carbon resources, cost containment, or fuel subsidies? And might I just add, Antoine, you mentioned transmission as an enabler for some of these goals, but if you could also address what other technologies we need to blend in, whether it is storage techniques or different types of generation like nuclear, how do you plan for that, and how are you planning for that long term? And let's start with you this time, Antoine. I'll give you the first word.
All right, thanks. Thank you. So Aubrey, you're going to have to react to this, I think. So how we conduct the planning, it really starts with an understanding of what the state mandates are, or the goals for a renewable integration in the future. And once we have a good fundamental or base knowledge of that, we incorporate that into the planning processes to try and determine really what level of transmission is going to be needed to facilitate that. So for instance, if a particular state has a renewable policy requirement that, say, 15% of its demand should be met with renewable resources, then we essentially run our planning simulations where we analyze the ability of the transmission network to allow that level of renewables to be delivered within that state. To the extent that there's transmission congestion or transmission unavailability to make that happen, that is the trigger for us to then evaluate opportunities to upgrade the transmission network or expand the transmission network to facilitate that transfer of energy to meet those goals. In addition to that, we're always trying to co-optimize reliability and economics as well. So we will perform market simulations where we're evaluating the economic benefits of allowing more of that energy to flow to meet those requirements, and then also comparing that to the cost of the different options of transmission. And we're looking for the set of solutions that provide the most value to customers. And that's usually measured by just benefit to cost ratios in that analysis. Now, as far as the different types of resources that are out there, I can tell you SPP's generator interconnection queue has about 100 gigawatts of generation in it. And I think roughly 45% of that is solar, and another 40% or so of that is wind. And then about 10% of it is storage. So those are the big resources that we're seeing a very clear signal are looking to interconnect to the system and really make up the future of the resource side of the equation for us. In addition to that, we're seeing a lot more of co-location between wind and storage resources, as well as solar and storage resources, and in some cases, all three at the same location to really take advantage of the different times when those resources are most efficient and effective. And then also taking advantage of the opportunity to lower customer prices by using the market and using storage resources to allow us to do something that traditionally we've not been able to do in this industry, which is store energy and be able to deploy it when needed and at the most from the most economic point and standpoint. I know there are a number of other technologies that are out there that are probably on the horizon at some point along the horizon, but I think those over the next 10 to 15 years, at least in the SPP footprint, continues to be wind, solar, and storage.
And when you say storage, Antoine, you're referring to battery storage, not hydrogen or compressed air. You're really talking about battery storage, right?
Yes, that's correct. Battery storage.
Well, Aubrey, would you like to take a crack at how the planning process accommodates some of these resources?
Sure, I'd say just a little bit of this is that you're going to hear a lot of ditto throughout these conversations. There is a lot that we have some similarities on, and I think ultimately one of the things we've learned, I think over the last year or so, is really how similar a lot of our issues are, our challenges are, as well as really ways that we have to try to think about going about that. And so I think that's one of the true benefits that we've gotten out of this JTIQ. It's just an improved platform of being able to talk and compare ideas and think about, what ways we can move and address the issues we have within our respective companies. Much like SPP, I think you think about this in a couple of different ways. We have our annual planning process, which we call it our MISO Transmission Expansion Plan, MTEP. This is it's an 18-month process that we do, every year that ends every year with a recommendation for an approval and set of projects by our board of directors. The majority of those projects are really other or baseline reliability projects, some generator interconnection queue projects, but they basically have a near-term focus, things that are going to be put in service in the next 3 to 8 years, potentially 10 years on the top side. And a lot of that is heavy local planning. That's something that's continually needed because your systems are always changing. The needs of the stakeholders, the customers are ever changing. And so this is what we do to make sure that we meet all of the applicable NERC standards and ensures the overall reliability of the grid. Baked within that, as Antoine talked about, we also try to make sure that the system operates efficiently. And so we'll do these market congestion planning studies. We'll do these interregional studies to try and make sure that all options are working well together. But for the last 2 years, one of the big focuses that MISO's had to really address the overall portfolio shift change that we're seeing now is this long-range transmission planning process. And as you mentioned, how do we take into account the state's goals and objectives? Well, we do scenario-based planning, and in that process, we've established 3 futures, and our focus is really on our future 1, where we used 100% of the IRPs and 85% of the announced plan. So if there's an IRP, we use that. We rolled all those up to create these scenarios that we think give us good bookends in order to plan for and to adjust and expect for the fact that there's no specific path that we're going to have, right? If we could identify exactly what transmission was needed 20 years from now, I think we'd all probably be doing something else, or we'd be on a circuit where we get to talk about it a lot more. But these scenarios give us our best opportunity to have what we call no regrets projects that are going to work regardless of what those future outcomes may actually be. And as a result to that, I'd say very much like SPP's queue, our queue today, I saw a report this morning, we have roughly 900 projects, 151 gigawatts in the queue. It's heavily weighted on solar, wind, and some battery storage, if you will, along those lines. I think when we start thinking about technology, there's a huge push to understand how hydrogen can work here, because it would give you more capability as a dispatchable resource. I think we don't see a lot of discussion about it, but one of the things for us to keep our thoughts and eyes on is small modular nuclear reactors. I think that there are opportunities for those to potentially be a resource that comes in play. But I think for the near term, what we're going to see and all of the planning will be around is ensuring that our systems can handle the solar and wind resources that are going to come on board and really are replacing a lot of our dispatchable resources, primarily coal. If you think back to 2005, 75% of the energy delivered in MISO came from coal resources. Today, that number is somewhere around 13%. It's higher than that, I'm sorry. It's in it's in the high 20s, if you will. And if you look at what our future is and the way that we project that, it will get into single digits. So a change is happening.
That's great. Maybe to twist a little bit back to the Infrastructure and Jobs Act discussion and DOE goals, you know, I know there has been a discussion by the DOE and Biden administration that they want to leverage existing RTO stakeholder venues to engage stakeholders and help implement their Building a Better Grid initiative. I think specifically the U.S. Department of Energy stated that it intends to utilize these stakeholder forums to, quote, identify nationally significant transmission lines, validate transmission modeling approaches, and provide technical analyses to our ISOs, RTOs, and utilities. From your perspective, and Aubrey, I'm gonna switch to you for this one, but from your perspective, how do the SPP and MISO stakeholder processes, how can they best be used by the DOE for its implementation efforts?
Thanks, Commissioner. So a couple of things. I'll start a little bit backwards, work my way to that. Both MISO and SPP also participate in the Eastern Interconnection Planning Collaborative, the EIPC. And we earlier this year also participated in the discussion with the DOE about the study. And we have in fact invited them to sit in on some of the ongoing workshops that exist in MISO today. So from our perspective, I think there's a couple of things where DOE can sit in and participate and understand. Obviously, in MISO, we have this ongoing 18 months that we are working for our MTEP, our MISO Transmission Expansion Plan. We also have these regular Planning Advisory Committee meetings. And right now, there's a meeting actually going on cost allocation that I stepped away from for this call. And so I think those are going to be the areas where I think it would be important for DOE to understand and participate and be a part of. So I'd argue this: if given the opportunity, MISO, SPP, all the RTOs, even the non-RTOs, they very much can understand and determine what types of transmission plans are needed. The real issue for DOE and others is to participate in cost allocation, because that's where the real challenge is around any kind of transmission development. It's understanding how we're going to have those resources paid for.
Great comment. Antoine, anything to add here?
Not a whole lot. I thought Aubrey was very thorough in that discussion, and we too at SPP are part of the Eastern Interconnection Planning Collaborative as well, and share a number of those thoughts. One thing I would add is just the consideration of really what we're planning for. I think at the beginning of this, I think as an RTO, what our focus is typically on is planning for the needs of our member utilities on behalf of them and their customers. And, as I mentioned before, when I talked about the excess resources that are looking to interconnect within SPP, for example, SPP has a peak demand of roughly 50 gigawatts. Right now, we have more than, I think, 80 gigawatts of generation on system with another 100 in the respective queue. So obviously, the SPP proper and its load does not need that level of generation. However, our planning processes are focused on developing the system to optimize the transmission network to serve SPP's customers. If the DOE is looking at a larger objective function, which is, maybe how we can more efficiently or effectively serve the entire Eastern interconnection, well, that is a different starting place for the planning process and likely will produce very different transmission planning projects. And I think, as Aubrey mentioned, EIPC is, I think, a pretty good clearinghouse for that. There's a group that already works together trying to look at the system from a larger, more holistic or comprehensive standpoint. And I think taking advantage of a venue like that will probably give a lot more clarity in being able to see and understand what the needs are across a larger region, a larger area. Those are things that even just going and meeting with stakeholders in SPP or in MISO may not show you. You may have to go to a larger group to be able to see that. And that's something that I think we would encourage.
Commissioner French, if I could just add on a little bit to that, I think Antoine makes a great point there. As part of what we did with our futures and future scenarios, one of the things we were targeting with Future One was to achieve a 40% carbon reduction from 2005 levels. And so that future as modeled today will give us roughly 63% carbon reduction within the MISO footprint for that. And so as Antoine has talked about, one of the things we have to think about if we look at this from a national perspective is what is that objective function, right? Are we trying to do that across the entire country? Are we trying to enable access to renewable energy for areas that it may not be as rich from a renewable energy perspective? And then again, ultimately what will happen there is how do you build a little bit of consensus around who's actually paying for those projects to actually achieve that? And so I think it is clearly a two-part effort, which is to identify what our objective function is, and then ensuring that we have an allocation methodology aligned to actually match that.
Well, that's a great discussion. You might have caught me making a giant X through my next question, because that was exactly what I was going to ask is, as I read the DOE, high level proposal, it strikes me that they're calling for massive investments within the SPP and MISO regions to harvest our resources, but perhaps to serve load in other areas. And so I was going to ask you, what are the challenges of that? I think, you've talked about the planning is different because you have a different starting point. You've talked about that cost allocation is going to be a challenge. And you identified that we do have a forum at EIPC. I don't know if there are other forums. We have a FERC task force, but anything else you'd want to add on challenges? Yeah. Go ahead.
I got a couple more for you.
I can tell.
So so one of a couple of things to think about that I think we have to also be very, very cognizant of is, when we think about this transmission, one of the greatest challenges we're going to have is how do you think about right of way, and how do you think about overall land usage throughout where this is delivered, and how do you make that case for that? The other thing that I think is important for us to think about is 100 megawatt solar site is the equivalent of 530 football fields. And so the amount of land that we're about to embark on to meet the needs that we're seeing is not trivial. And I think, again, one of the key things that we have to think about is how do we develop a message that really speaks to an overall collective good and what this does for all of the country, not just the impact that happens on these two regions.
Yeah, and I'd add to that in the DOEs in the initiative, and when you read through it on the cost allocation side of it, it does identify, I think, pretty well some of the challenges associated with development of these resources, land use being one of them. But another large one that it discusses is the financial uncertainty associated with the development of these renewable projects without the identification of an end-use customer or off-taker for a purchase power agreement, if you will. And you kind of get into this, do loop where developers are trying to determine who to sell to, and those who are looking to buy want to know what's available. Both kind of looking at each other to try and figure out what the other's going to do before being able to make the next step. Support with funding typically helps that. Subsidies on the transmission side I think could help that. What we've seen over the past decade or so has been subsidy on the generation side of things. And I think by looking at the size of our queues, we can say that that part's working. But now the transmission has become the bottleneck, and subsidies in that area might be able to address some of the concerns that are there. Now, the initial numbers that I see from the DOE are they're just not significant or large enough to provide the type of incentive that's probably necessary to overcome some of the transmission challenges, including the cost, as well as land usage and acquisition, things of that sort. People who hold the land, they value it, and it can be a significant cost to transmission development. So I think that's another consideration, is going to have to be the scale of financial support that will be necessary to really move the needle to get steel in the ground and wires in the air.
Again, my colleague makes really great comments there, and it's a good setup and stuff to keep this conversation going forward. I'd add a couple other things to that as well. Also, is that one of the things that I think is really, really important for us to also note and think about is really transfer capability within the various regions and how that may work. If we go back to Winter Storm Uri, I believe we were getting roughly 14 gigawatts from PJM at our peak period. And at the same time, we were passing 6 gigawatts over to SPP at that peak period. I think that was a point in time where they had the most imports that they ever had on the history of their system. As we move to a more intermittent system and have a greater dependence on reliability on intermittent resources, it will be increasingly important for our transmission planning processes to really think about how we are integrated from a transfer capability perspective. And one of the things that I think when we think about transmission needs, I don't know so much that I think it's about having a transmission line from Kansas going into Pennsylvania, right? I think about how do we strengthen the ties between Pennsylvania and Ohio? How do we make sure that we do things more coordinated around the seams to really increase that? Because if we're doing that and we're doing the same thing, you know, on the MISO and SPP seam and really increasing that, as Antoine mentioned earlier, they got 40 gigawatts sitting around available to be used daily, right? And so it's about how do we create more of that interregional flow, if you will, that I think is part of what we need to do to unleash what I think the objective is behind the DOE work.
Gosh, you know, I would love to stay on that for the remainder of the time, because I agree. I really want to know not just how we increase connectivity, but then how do we make sure transactions happen, not just in times of emergency, but how do we make sure that transactions optimally happen to move that energy between the regions? I think we're going to have to keep that question in our back pocket for just a second, though. Because we're getting short on time, and I do want to ask you briefly about the JTIQ study. And then I want to leave hopefully a minute or two for any audience questions. So SPP and MISO have just now completed the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue study. How does this study differ from the tariff mandated coordinated system planning process, which has yet to identify a mutually beneficial project? And aside from the current portfolio of JTIQ projects, what do you foresee coming from the JTIQ effort? And we'll start with Antoine on this one.
All right, thank you. So for the JTIQ, for those that aren't as familiar with it, JTIQ stands for Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study. And this is a study that SPP and MISO decided to work together on and develop or collaborate to identify transmission facilities that might enable a number of interconnections of new generation along our respective seams, but also do that in a manner that creates value for our load serving customers as well. And that's basically by taking advantage of the relative economics of the energy that could be interconnected by the new transmission facilities. And so over time in our respective generator interconnection queues, we continue to just run into constraints, sometimes the same constraints along our seams, but looking at them in that siloed fashion, the cost of those upgrades would be too much to bear for any individual or small group of individuals. And so this joint study was intended to create value by bringing more players together and also analyzing the system needs all at once to get a better understanding of what those needs are for more holistic or more comprehensive assessment, but then also bringing more potential payers into the fold based on the fact that more parties are benefiting as well. And then by spreading those costs across a larger group of beneficiaries, we could make the development of these transmission projects more affordable for more parties. And I think we're seeing that to date in the study. When you talk about what really differs between this and an existing process that we have to try and evaluate, I think similar things as far as needs along our seams, which is our coordinated system planning study, is really, we went into this study with a phrase Aubrey uses that I really liked. He says, we're going to break all the rules. Well, one of the challenges that we had with the CSP is we had all of the rules established on how we would identify needs and how we would identify solutions before really having the opportunity to assess what the issues were and what the opportunities were to resolve those issues. I think that approach does have its benefits, right? People have somewhat of certainty to understand exactly what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And then the always important piece, who's going to pay and how it's going to be paid for. The challenge with that latter piece of it, the cost allocation piece and that upfront transparency, is sometimes who's going to pay begins to impact the different participants or stakeholders in the process, their decisions on how to conduct the study. And, you know, from our perspective, we just want to identify what the system needs and what are the best solutions to address that. And then the cost is something that is important, but comes after that. And so with this study, the JTIQ study, we went into this giving ourselves the ultimate flexibility to make assumptions for the study, identify needs, and then also determine what are the best technical solutions that create or provide the most value to customers and consumers. Once we'd identified that and we're able to identify the value and benefits to all the different participants, at that point, we would then begin the discussion of who pays and how much. And I think it's usually a better conversation when you can bring something of value to people and then say, well, how much do you want to pay for it? And I think that's kind of where we are really at this point in time in the process. And by people being able to see the benefits and believe in the benefits, we think we're having much more productive conversations about the cost allocation paradigm, and also providing a lot more transparency for those who would pay to understand from their own view and their own perspective what the value is to them and how and at what level they should participate. So I think overall it's been a success up to this point, but we are really scratching the surface now on the cost allocation piece of it. And that's really where our focus is going to be over the next several months, to try and not only close this out with a good report, but also close it out with commitments to move forward with construction of projects that have been identified.
Yeah. I just add, I think, again, Antoine's reference, we're publishing the final report this week that will really memorialize all the work efforts that our teams put forward. I think one of the things that we recognize throughout this is really the challenges. If you're in the MISO stakeholder process, you like the way MISO does things, or maybe not. And if you're an SPP stakeholder, you like the way SPP does things, or maybe not. And I think their challenge is that we're trying to work with both stakeholders really at the same time, and basically saying we need to do some things differently to try to get to a different outcome. I think, again, one of the things that we still have some work to do is trying to determine the impact on affected system studies, because these are the things we can actually continue to show to give that full picture value, if you will, for those potential interconnection customers. The other thing there also is really kind of setting the table going forward. One of the things that's been a good beneficiary out of this was we've been able to make some enhancements or make some efforts on our Q priority. That's a result that came out of all of this work, working together, better understanding SPP's needs, better understanding MISO's needs, and being able to get to a Q priority that both of us can live with. I think the last year has also put us in a better position to take up this challenge that the SEAMS Liaison Committee has given insofar as developing a targeted market efficiency project for the SPP MISO SEAM. And I think, again, the work that we've done over the last year plus, understanding each other and learning more about each other's processes, and really being, again, Antoine talked about, we went into this kind of breaking all the rules. I think we need to carry some of that forward as we think about trying to develop a TMAP allocation as well.
Brief lightning round question as a follow-up. What do you see moving forward? I mean, is JTIQ a one-off study, or is this something that's replicable or iterative that could be used again to make a more meshed network across the seam, or continue to solve interconnection issues along the seam? Or is this something we just use from time to time as issues arise? How do you see the future of this?
We hadn't talked about this a whole lot, but I think we're in the final mile, if you will, of the marathon relative to cost allocation. I think as we solve that and get an opportunity for these projects to be built, I think it gives us a window of what the possibility could be. So I don't know that we have a cadence around how we do this, but I think we've clearly seen value, and it is something that will end up getting revisited at some point in time.
Go ahead, Antoine.
Yeah. I agree. One of the things we talked about early on was doing somewhat of a post-analysis, lessons learned type, activity to really look at things that we really enjoyed or thought was really good from the program, or from the initiative, and then others that we could build upon. But I think what we're going to see on both sides of the seam with this is a number of findings on things that we can start making changes or improvements to existing processes today. And so being able to bring forward some of the value we've gotten out of this effort in that manner, which would not require us to, say, do a JTIQ type study all the time to still get a lot of the benefits and the value. But I've enjoyed this assessment. I think it's been valuable, and I think it's been really good. So I know I'd be open, to considerations of what's the right way or the best way to continue to progress going forward. And I think, as Aubrey mentioned, as we get through this cost allocation phase, I think we'll have a more complete picture of what our opportunity is.
Well, I love the theme of breaking all the rules moving forward. For both of you, go ahead,
I think I probably take less of the CEO meetings we had to have. I mean, it's just a little bit of pressure when you got to talk to all your bosses all the time about the progress that you're making. So
that's right.
There's some challenge in that.
Well, I want to give you both an opportunity for some brief closing statements, but I also want to just check in with the audience and see if there are any questions before we move on to that. And folks could either type something in the chat or raise a hand, or I think everybody has the capability, if somebody wanted to come off mute and just ask a question, I would certainly invite that at this time. So let me just pause. I'm not seeing any hands. I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Commissioner?
Oh, it's my colleague Susan Duffy from the great state of Kansas. Commissioner Duffy, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. This report that's just on the precipice of being released, is that formally going to federal entities for them to look at, review, or comment on? One, and two, do you believe that perhaps you've developed a model in this exercise that of the JTIQ that you could share with others? Thank you.
I'll let either one of you address that.
Just gonna see who jumped on it first. So I'll start with the second question. For SPP, we don't have a lot of other SEAMS neighbors right now. Our largest is MISO to our east. We have DC ties and limited connectivity to the west of us. But I do frequently have conversations or meetings with my counterparts at other RTOs. And I know that, PJM, for instance, was really interested in what we were doing and thought it was a pretty good thing. Now, whether or not they want to reach out and try and do something like that with MISO or their other neighbors, I don't know. But I know that they've asked a lot of questions and were interested in seeing what we did. And I believe they'll follow it to completion, and whether or not it's something that they want to pursue and do going forward will be up to them. As far as the report, we haven't had any specific discussions, I think, yet about the distribution of that. However, as RTOs, ISOs, we do these studies and reports. It's all public and transparent where it's posted, and we have open stakeholder meetings where we accept feedback related to our work product and adjust from there. So it will be a public report that anyone can read, and we're always open for feedback and comments.
Thank you. I just really believe that time is of the essence as we look at the resilience of the grid and all grid issues. And I liken this to the federal highway system. And I just feel a sense of urgency is everywhere, but yet, okay, here we have an example of two RTOs that come together. They've done a study. It shows some value. So I'm hoping then that we'll be able to move forward, but not move forward alone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Duffy. I'm not seeing any other hands or anything in the chat, although folks, jump in right now if you want to ask a question, because I'm getting ready to let these guys do a closing statement. Let's move to some very brief closing statements, and just any thoughts that are on your mind out of this discussion, and I'll begin with Aubrey. I think we may have lost Aubrey. Antoine, do you want to go?
Sure. I never miss an opportunity to state this, because it's something that's really important to me. As we continue this transition from these traditional thermal resources, it really puts a lot of stress and importance around resource adequacy, because once we begin becoming dependent upon intermittent resources, we really have to have a very, very good understanding of what the availability is of those resources that we can always count on to meet customer demand. We can never forget the importance of the service that we provide to really to homes and businesses, and having that availability of energy. And so if we're going to continue to expand the availability and the usage of these resources, we're going to have to continue to improve and refine our processes to understand the reliability implications and impacts of doing so, and be willing to take that into true consideration when we're developing the transmission system and the network to allow this to happen. And that will not be without cost. So it's just something that needs to be in that equation, something that always needs to be considered. And I think if we can do that, we'll have a much better opportunity of making this happen and doing so in a harmonious fashion that provides the most value to the most people.
That's a great reminder that keeping the lights on is job number one. And I think that's much appreciated by this audience. Aubrey, do we have you back?
Aubrey just rejoined us. He's there we go.
Aubrey, would you like to make a brief closing statement if we have you back? And there is a question that just showed up in the chat. If you want to address that, feel free. Aubrey, you may be on mute. Well, it looks like we may not have gotten Aubrey back. So I think, Sarah, we will just kick it to you at this point in time, if you're ready to close us out.
All right. Sorry about the technical glitch with Aubrey. You guys did great. So excited. This was such a great panel. If our audience can fill out a brief survey to evaluate this little webinar, we would really appreciate it. The link is in the chat. You can always contact me, Skent at missouri.edu. If you have any questions about the FRI, we'd love to hear from you about all of our programs. I will make sure that we capture this question that got put in the chat towards the end of it. And hopefully Aubrey or Antoine or Commissioner French can get back to you. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful afternoon. And don't forget to join us again for part 2 on March 9th at noon.